Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Brian Liddy. It's Friday the 6th of October. I'm happy to say that here and we've got with us tonight Olaf Stando, again after his first time with us on the Full Scottish. Hello Olaf, how are you doing?
Hi Brian, yeah, I'm doing well. It's been definitely a day full of news, lots to digest, I'm sure.
Yes.
It's a bit rainy as well, but hopefully our conversation will inject a bit of hope into the gloomy weather.
Olaf, could you maybe say a little bit about the organisation that you've set up, just as a way of an introduction to yourself to the viewers?
Sure. So the organisation that I've set up is basically a human rights campaign. It's a pan-European human rights campaign based around 16, people from 16 different European countries. It's called Never Again Right Now, and it's essentially a campaign for a fairer migration system. It's an advocacy campaign that basically works with parliamentarians across the EU to push for a fairer system, more compassionate system on migration. But it's also a direct action group which basically empowers people to do actions in their local communities and countries to protest the Fortress Europe approach. So that's Never Again Right Now. I'm also involved in the SNP Youth Wing, Young Scots for Independence. I'm on the national executive there, and I'm also on the national executive of SNP Socialists. So yeah, I suppose a couple of hats on
That's great.
tonight.
Thanks. That's a much better introduction than I could ever have given you. So I'll start tonight's show with our usual Ukraine update, and today is day 590. At least 51 people, including a 6-year-old boy, were killed during a missile attack on a cafe during a wake service in the village of Horza in the Kharkiv region on Thursday, Ukrainian officials have said. According to preliminary findings, Russia targeted the cafe with an Iskander ballistic missile, Ukraine's Minister of Internal Affairs has said. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky accused Russia of genocidal aggression after the attack. He described it as a demonstrably brutal Russian crime, a rocket attack on an ordinary grocery store, a completely deliberate act of terrorism, later saying it was no blind strike. European leaders rallied around the Ukrainian president in the face of US jitters over defence funding. The gathering at the European Political Community, or EPC, summit in Granada in Spain gave leaders including the French President Emmanuel Macron, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak a chance to restate their commitment to Ukraine after political turbulence in the US and Europe raised questions about continued support. Germany will do everything possible so that Ukraine can protect itself from Russian missiles, Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock said on Thursday after Moscow's latest deadly strike in Ukraine. The Biden administration is considering using a US State Department grant program to send additional military aid to Ukraine. Politico reported on Thursday, citing 2 US officials with knowledge of the discussions. Slovakia will not send more military aid to Ukraine for now, Prime Minister Ludovic Odor said. Instead, the decision will be delayed until a new government is formed following last week's election, which saw a victory for Robert Fico, a populist pro-Russian 3-time former Prime Minister who campaigned on a promise to end military aid to Ukraine. President Biden wants to give a major speech on support for Ukraine, the White House press secretary Karine Jean-Pierre has said. She described the Horozha missile attack as horrifying. Vladimir Putin ramped up his nuclear rhetoric, saying his country had successfully tested the nuclear-powered, nuclear-capable Bereznik strategic cruise missile as he suggested Russia could resume nuclear testing for the first time in more than 3 decades. Putin also suggested that the plane crash that killed Wagner mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin in August was caused by hand grenades detonating inside the aircraft, not by a missile attack. So, Olaf, was there anything in tonight's update that caught your eye?
Well, I suppose that last bit shows just how grotesque Vladimir Putin's propaganda machine really is, as if we're just supposed to believe that somehow, that's the end of the story. A grenade went off, and that was the totally unsuspicious death of Prigozhin, and Putin had nothing to do with it. It's just absolutely wild. But look, on a broader on a broader level, what's happening in Ukraine with the bombing of civilian targets, nothing to do with military, just shows how desperate Russia is in this stage of the war, and yet how important it is to keep supporting Ukraine at this delicate phase. You've got the prospect of Trump entering the White House next year. You've got populists like Robert Fico winning across Europe. In Slovakia, we might have a right-wing government in Poland in 10 days' time as well. So that really reminds us that it's important to stand shoulder to shoulder with the people of Ukraine.
Thank you, Olaf. Yeah, I must admit, it does sound a bit like, I mean, something like a grenade going off, it's not going to show up in the black box or anything like that. So who knows where he got this idea from. But I'll move on to our next item. In a devastating defeat for the SNP, the Labour Party candidate, Michael Shanks, has won the Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election with a swing of over 20% from the SNP to Labour. Shanks took double the vote of the SNP's Katie Loudon, winning by 17,845 votes to 8,399 for the SNP. The Conservative candidate, Thomas Kerr, lost his deposit. Sir Keir Starmer joined Anna Sarwar and Michael Shanks in Rutherglen this morning. Starmer said, "They said that we couldn't change the Labour Party and we did it. They said we couldn't win in the south of England and the north of England and we did it. They said you'll never beat the SNP in Scotland and Rutherglen, you did it, you blew the doors off." So what motivated voters in Rutherglen and Hamilton West to switch from SNP to Labour? Many have expressed dissatisfaction with the actions of Margaret Ferrier, which led to her censure in the House of Commons, and the recall petition, which removed her as MP. However, others said they felt that Ms Ferrier was treated unfairly by the parliamentary authorities and by the SNP. The Labour Party campaigned returned to saying, "You have got to vote Labour if you want to get rid of the Tories." However, this has raised many contradictions, as Labour have said they will stick to Tory policies as they try to win Conservative votes in England. The SNP has been called a failing government, unable to get things done, a line regularly used by the media in Scotland, but does this allegation stand up to scrutiny? The Conservative candidate lost his deposit as Tory voters switched to vote Labour. To what extent will tactical voting be a factor in the general election? The SNP's candidate, Katie Loudon, was widely recognised as having fought a good campaign, but being the incumbent party, the SNP took some blame for there being a by-election. The resignation of Nicola Sturgeon and the ongoing police inquiries generated a lot of negative media for the party, and the leadership election, coming when it did, opened up some divisions in the party, which might have led to many SNP and independent supporters staying at home on a wet and miserable polling day. Did the SNP get their messaging right, and did it reach the voters? Since the recall petition was announced, the media has been talking up Labour's resurgence in Scotland. According to media reports, independence is well down the people's list of priorities. The media has the media reported accurately reflected the mood in Scotland, or has it been a case of them repeating the message often enough and loud enough that it became a self-fulfilling prophecy? So, Olaf, Labour have doubled their number of Scottish MPs in Scotland overnight, and the Tory party have lost their deposit, so congratulations to both of those parties. Meanwhile, the SNP must be smarting, or must feel the sting from this result. Labour are pleased with it, as they should be, and the SNP, they'd be over the moon if they got this result. And yet, Labour has its lowest share of the vote since 1910. And this seat has swung every single time there's been an election between the SNP and Labour. What do you think? I mean, what did cause people to change from... Oh, we've just lost... hello. You okay?
Hiya. Yeah, looks like we had a connection issue there. I'm not sure what happens. Can you hear me now?
Yes. I was just wondering what your thoughts are on what caused people to swing this time from SNP back to Labour.
Look, it was a humbling result. There's no other way to put it. The SNP has suffered one of the biggest defeats in the past couple of years. We've been quite used to SNP dominating the political scene since 2015, and clearly there is a wind of change blowing towards Labour, and we cannot get away from that. I think a couple of caveats first. This was a by-election, as you mentioned, 37% turnout. The turnout makes it very difficult to extrapolate this onto a national level. The fact is that the vast majority of the SNP people did not switch to Labour, but stayed at home. I think that is also a problem in itself, and it's worth reflecting on that, and it's worth looking at how we can make sure that they have something concrete to vote for, and that we can beat the apathy. But
Oh dear, we really do have a bad connection this evening. I apologise to viewers. I'm just going to hold on and wait and see if Olaf is able to come back in, but if not, I might have no option but to go on with the next item. I'm going to do that. We can come back to this SNP. Oh, hello, Olaf. I was just about to maybe move on to the next item, but on you go.
I have no idea what's going on with the internet. I mean, my internet seems to be quite stable.
Well,
I've moved to a different room, but let's try again. Right, one last try. Where did I end?
I don't even think you even really got to start. What do you think was the reason for the move from SNP to Labour for voters? Oh dear. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next item, and hopefully we can come back to the Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election result. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer has been forced to defend his decision to work with The Sun ahead of his party's conference in Liverpool, a city where the newspaper faces targeted boycotts and is largely despised. Starmer was challenged in an interview with ITV political correspondent Andrew Misra, who asked him why he continues to write for a paper that is widely boycotted in Liverpool after promising he wouldn't give interviews to The Sun in his 2020 leadership campaign. Attempting to justify his U-turn, Starmer said that he had to make sure that what Labour has to say is communicated to as many people as possible, and that is why he was very happy to work with The Sun, to write for The Sun, to do interviews with The Sun. His U-turn has upset Liverpudlians since he used Liverpool's anger with The Sun to gain political advantage during his 2020 leadership campaign, when he said in a speech, "The city has been wounded by the media, The Sun. I certainly won't be giving an interview to The Sun during the course of this campaign." The feeling in Liverpool about The Sun remains strong today. In 2017, Liverpool Football Club prohibited Sun journalists from entering the club's ground, Anfield, barring them from matches and press events. The feeling is so strong that city rivals Everton FC's Goodison Park Stadium brought in a similar ban shortly after that. And I'm just wondering if Olaf is back with us. Hello, Olaf.
I've switched to a different room. I had to get away from my desk, but I'm not sure if the connection's any better right now. Let me just.
It sounds good, and we certainly appreciate your valiant attempts to stay with us.
It might be the rain or stormy weather that's disconnecting me from that.
Yeah,
what that could be.
So you probably didn't have a chance to hear. I just went on and did the next item, which was Keir Starmer. But shall we go back to the forgive me, now my earpiece is playing up. The Rutherglen and Hamilton West issue.
Yeah.
How about we just say, what are your thoughts in general? Let's start with a very general question like that, since we're losing time.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think it was a very tough result for the SNP. There was no going, there's no point beating around the bush. It was a very, very difficult result. It was a humbling result. I think the scale of the defeat was a lot worse than we expected. And, this is a big, big victory for Labour. I think a couple of caveats that you have to add to this is, firstly, the turnout was very low. So we're talking about a 37% turnout, which means that it's quite difficult to extrapolate a national result out of a turnout like this. Obviously, by-elections have their own dynamics. You've had Margaret Ferrier coming up on the doorsteps a lot. I've been in Rutherglen myself. I've been speaking to people in Rutherglen, and a lot of people chose not to back the SNP this time, to basically give the SNP a kicking, to spur the SNP into a moment of change. But look, fundamentally, we can't just dismiss that. We can't be looking for poor excuses. I think it's really important for the party to reflect, to regroup, to take conclusions from this and to act quickly and to change. Um, and we can, we can talk a bit more about what that change should be. I'm sure there's lots of different versions and there's lots of different interpretations of what went wrong. But fundamentally, the party has to excite its base again. It has to get people out to the ballots. It has to give people the reason to vote for it again, because there's a lot of apathy going around. There's apathy among Labour ranks, I'm sure. There's apathy among Tory ranks, but the apathy among the SNP ranks seems to be the biggest at the moment. And the big reason why the SNP lost quite so badly is that the bulk of the SNP electorate from 2019 just stayed at home.
And what do you think of the media coverage in the run-up to the vote yesterday? Thinking really specifically about the charges or the when Nicola Sturgeon was arrested and Peter Murrell and the like. What do you think about the quality of the media coverage in the run-up to the by-election? Did that make a difference?
I think, look, the fact that the media across the UK is very London-centric and centralised and doesn't really understand Scotland, doesn't make the point of understanding Scotland, shows firstly why it's so important to have channels like Broadcasting Scotland and independent media landscape in Scotland, because there is a lack of nuance when it comes to Scottish politics, and a lot of things are very skewed by broadcasters that should know better. And I think, that there's been the issue of Labour bigging up the expectations and Labour sort of being seen as a shoo-in for that constituency, which I suppose made people more apathetic to vote because it didn't seem close, right? It seemed like it was a guaranteed Labour victory. So I suppose the expectations management is quite important there. But I think we can't be blaming it on the media. I think there are much bigger reasons as to why the SNP did not win that seat. There's a lot of analysis to be had in terms of the scale of the defeat as well. And I think it's really important to reflect and to regroup and to make sure that we come back at the next election with a credible offer on independence, with a path that looks credible not just to yes supporters but to ordinary voters. We need to make sure that we inject a bit more radicalism into our domestic policy agenda, because we need to excite people, give them an agenda that's actually worth voting for. When it comes to things like public ownership, when it comes to things like land reform, taxing wealth, these sort of things that the Scottish Government could start to explore. And fundamentally, it's about rebuilding trust with the electorate and making sure that people see the SNP as a people's party, as a party for all of Scotland, and not just a party mired in crisis, as a lot of people see it now.
And I'm intrigued about the historic trend in Rutherglen and Hamilton West. So Labour's vote peaked in that area in 2010. They got 28,586 votes. Yesterday they got 17,845 votes. And if you turn every single election in that ward into a graph, the line steadily falls. There's no uptick at any point on that since 2010. And then I don't know if you saw the recent polling that was done by the Tony Blair Institute, which says that although Labour may be on the rise in Scotland and SNP voters might be on the decline, support for Scottish independence is on the up. It's up 4%, I think it said. So do you think that these two things are going to cross over at some point? Labour's falling, they won the seat, but the vote is falling, and support for independence rising. I don't know if you can make a question out of that. Or...
I think it's heartening that support for independence is as high as it is. I mean, it's great to be back in majority territory again. It's funny that the one poll that puts us ahead is the Tony Blair Institute research. There's a certain irony of that with Labour winning Rutherglen today. But look, it's definitely an issue of a lot of yes voters not trusting the SNP and abandoning the SNP, at least temporarily. And there's a bit of a disconnect, isn't there, between yes voters and SNP voters. I suppose a lot of that is down to apathy. We don't see huge amounts of voters flocking to the Greens or to other parties, other smaller parties. But we definitely have to have a more credible offer on independence, right? We need to harness that yes vote. There is a consistent, 45, 50% for yes. Obviously, some polls put us ahead. But we have to harness that. And what I mean by that is we have to show people Now we've got a credible route to actually achieving that. So whether it's through a referendum or whether it's through a de facto referendum, and also show people a transformative case for a better Scotland. So we need to convince people that Scotland's going to be richer, Scotland's going to be fairer, Scotland's going to be greener after independence. And you do that by publishing papers. The Scottish government's been doing that, but I also think it's about connecting that to bread and butter issues, connecting that to the cost of living crisis, connecting that to the energy crisis, which everyone across Scotland is facing, even though we're an energy-rich country. I think it's about making sure that the arguments about independence are easy to understand, easy to digest, and are bread and butter issues, not just abstract sort of issues for the future.
Thanks, Olaf. And I'm going to try and meld the item that you wouldn't have heard while you were transferring rooms, which was that Keir Starmer has been criticised for his U-turn over working with the Sun in the run-up to his leadership campaign, which he won. He said that he wouldn't work with the Sun, he wouldn't interview them or have anything to do with them, and now the opposite is true. And he said that he's got no option. I'm paraphrasing here. He's got no option to do that because he needs everybody in the UK to be able to hear what Labour has to say if they're going to win the next general election. And of course, Labour are using the win in Rutherglen and Hamilton West to say that this is a surefire thing, that there's going to be a Labour government at the next general election and a huge increase of Labour MPs in Scotland. What do you think of that? Is any of that bound to happen?
I mean, look, what is the point of Labour these days, right? What is the point of Labour when you have Keir Starmer breaking every single promise that he's made in the 2021 contest? Or was it 2020? I think it was 2020. When you have, Keir Starmer courting the Tory vote by regularly writing in The Sun, but not just The Sun, also The Express, The Telegraph, The Daily Mail. Keir Starmer himself said that he's a true conservative and that the Labour Party now evokes true conservatism. He said that he's not afraid of being a fiscal conservative. He is trying to woo Tory voters on migration. Just a week after the Tories had a conspiracy fest at their annual conference in Manchester. And obviously the Tories are descending into Enoch Powell-esque rhetoric on migration. It is absurd, actually, that despite Labour being 20 points ahead in the polls, they're still drifting further and further to the right. And it kind of perplexes me, right? Because you'd have thought that with that kind of lead, with that kind of strong position in the polls, Labour could allow itself to go back to its social democratic roots and could allow itself to be a bit more, I'm not even saying radical, to being a bit more centrist. But as it stands, Labour is not centrist. Labour is actually a pretty right-wing party on a lot of issues, especially if you compare it to centrist parties in the rest of Europe. Labour is looking pretty right-wing. And I think you have to ask the question, who is it that Keir Starmer is actually speaking to? Is he speaking to ordinary working class voters that are facing cost of living issues and that want to see a better society, that want to see a transformed world? Or is he speaking to Rupert Murdoch and speaking to the billionaire press and big business interests that he's trying to so desperately court that he's forgetting what Labour actually stands for? It is perplexing, and I really hope that he changes course. But really what that illustrates is that Scotland, whether it's Labour, whether it's Tories at Westminster, Scotland isn't going to get the best sort of future with those people in charge at Westminster. It's much better to take charge of our own future instead.
And I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's another irony. You mentioned about Labour, whether it's left wing or right wing. And you also mentioned Rupert Murdoch. I don't know how many people know that The Sun was originally called the Daily Herald, and the Daily Herald newspaper at the time started in the 1920s, I think I'm right in saying, and at its peak in the 1930s, and it was very strongly socialist, aligned to socialist values. At its peak, it was the biggest selling newspaper in the world. It regularly used to sell more than 1 million copies a day at the time. That was a record-breaking. And at one time, the Labour Party actually owned the Daily Herald newspaper because it was at risk of going under. And then eventually it did decline, and figures fell and became less popular. And it transformed and did a rename and rebranded and became The Sun. And then Rupert Murdoch came along and bought it up. I think it was the first title that he bought, and of course that is now where it is with the current leader of the Labour Party being criticised for writing articles in it. I don't know if that's put everybody off and we should move on to the next item, or whether you want to say something. Or
I think the one quick reflection, I suppose two quick reflections are as follows, right? Firstly, Rupert Murdoch has way too much power over the UK election cycle and over the UK media landscape. Obviously, Rupert Murdoch doesn't just own The Sun, he owns The Times, he owns The Times Radio, several broadcasters and print media, and he's obviously not a UK citizen. He is based in Australia. And his interests are not aligned with the interests of the 99%. I suppose what's also a bit absurd is that the UK is a country which has a really polarized press landscape, right? I've got a lot of friends from Germany, for example, and when I tell my German friends about the fact that every single newspaper in the UK takes a line on who to vote for, will simply publish editorials the day before the election and tell you you've got to vote Tory or you've got to vote Labour. It's absurd, right? That's not how a mature media system should be working. That's not what journalism should look like. I think in the ideal world, you should have a situation where newspapers hold the powerful to account, and obviously they can have a slight, free market slant or socialist slant or whatever, but they should not be agents for a political party telling people directly how to vote. I think that in itself is a big problem with the UK media landscape.
thank you, Olaf. I'll move on to the next item. The UK government has misrepresented the Climate Change Committee, or the CCC, by wrongly claiming it said we would need a quarter of our energy to come from fossil fuels by 2050, scientists have said. In order to justify signing off new oil and gas licences in the North Sea, ministers have said the country will still require a quarter of its energy to come from gas in 2050, the year the UK is supposed to meet net zero. The Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, or DESNZ, says the figure comes from the CCC, the government's statutory advisory body, which has strongly advised against licensing new fossil fuels. Claire Coutinho, the UK Energy Security and Net Zero Secretary, said recently, "We will not play politics with our energy security. Even the independent CCC has said that in 2050 we will need oil and gas for a quarter of our energy." The DESNZ has been reported as saying that the figure often cited by the department came from the CCC's sixth carbon budget. When asked for its methodology, or how it arrived at this figure from the CCC's data, the department did not comment. A spokesperson for the CCC said, "The data is used from our sixth carbon budget, but they used their own calculation to get to that. It is understood the committee does not endorse a 25% figure." Professor Michael Grubb from University College London said, "I cannot find any credible basis for the government's claim, not in the CCC analysis, nor in any serious analysis of net zero scenarios." Professor Sam Frankhauser from the Smith School at the University of Oxford said, "I have now looked at the sixth carbon budget advice and could not find an explicit reference to oil and gas use in 2050. So the 25% figure must have been derived indirectly. It's hard to know how this was done." Bob Ward from the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics said the data did not show that the UK would still need a quarter of its energy from gas by 2050. He said, "I can confirm," excuse me, he said, "I can confirm that the CCC has never claimed that 25% of the UK's energy will be generated from fossil fuels in 2050. It is difficult to know how the government has calculated this figure. It may have used a data table published by the CCC in December 2021, which includes information about energy demand for every year up to 2050 in its balanced net zero pathway." So, Olaf, as I was reading that item out, it took me straight back to the days before the Brexit referendum, and Michael Gove telling us that we shouldn't listen to experts.
I was literally going to say that.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Nah. Great minds think alike.
And then, of course, during COVID, I don't know. I mean, this. What do you think? Is this once again the UK government giving us reason to places like the European Union to just kind of keep their distance from us?
Well, the UK government, which has had enough of experts, and that's their guiding policy, is apparently taking long-term decisions for a brighter future, which are actually very short-termist and damaging decisions for a burned future. right? It is absolutely absurd that somehow Rishi Sunak says that we're sticking to our target, that we can still achieve net zero by 2050, while dropping the ban on new diesel and petrol cars in 2030, still essentially blocking a lot of the wind proposals onshore because of Tory NIMBYism, not investing in renewables sufficiently, and now talking about some sort of supposed imagined war on motorists, which just doesn't really exist apart from Tory imagination and GB News talking points. So it is absolutely absurd, but it's also dangerous, right? Because we now have a battleground in the election coming up where net zero is going to be one of the biggest talking points, right? Net zero and migration are likely to be among the biggest kind of culture war issues. And they shouldn't be culture war issues, right? I mean, the climate change issue clearly should be determined by experts, by international forums where nations come together and they agree their carbon budgets or they agree their action collectively. It should not be up to the whim of a desperate Tory government that is desperate to win votes by appealing to UKIP types and Nigel Farage rhetoric. It's really odd, and all I can hope for is that there's a change of government next year, that the Labour government, which looks like it's on its way to Downing Street, does a bit better. But the UK should stop, grandstanding and thinking that it's not responsible for climate change, and actually look back at the history of causing climate change and emissions through industrial revolution, of exporting a lot of its emissions and a lot of its waste to the global south as well. And it's just a sorry state of affairs, isn't it?
Yes. I think it's probably fair to say that when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, the politicians who are currently in government, the likes of Suella Braverman, they were taking notes, and now they're following the same methodology. But I'll move on. Time's against us, so I'll move on to the next item. UK businesses are reluctant to make large investments in machinery and new technology, while barriers to trade with the European Union remain in place and interest rates are high, according to a survey by the British Chambers of Commerce. The Business Lobby Group said the vast majority of respondents to its quarterly economic survey had frozen or cut investment plans, while only 23% said they were considering fresh injections of cash to improve the way they operated. In a signal that pause in business investment dating back to the Brexit vote in 2016 was still in place, 59% of the 5,000 respondents reported no change, and 18% saw a decrease. The BCC said that over the last 6 years, investment had flatlined and even in the pre-pandemic period remained stuck in first gear. During this period, the number of firms increasing investment never reached more than 28%, the percentage recorded in the first quarter of 2018. At the start of the pandemic, in early 2020, investment intentions dropped as low as 9%. David Barrier, the lobby group's head of research, said the result of the surveys point to tough trading conditions for many firms as inflation, labour shortages, global trade barriers and interest rate rises continue to bite. He said uncertainty about the government's plans for infrastructure developments and the threat of further customs checks at the EU border were also holding back investment. Most firms continue to report no increase to their investment intentions. This is in part a reflection of broader uncertainty, with little clarity on major long-term projects and yet more trade barriers to come with the EU, he said. So, Olaf, this reluctance with business to invest in Britain and infrastructure, is there any way, do you think, that we can be optimistic anymore?
I don't think so. I'm sorry to put a downer on your evening, Brian, and the rest of our listeners. Look, I think, do you remember in 2016 when the Brexiteers were saying that getting the Brexit deal is going to be the easiest thing in the world and it just takes a single meeting over a cup of tea and it'll be sorted? It was Michael Gove, I think, who said that we hold all the cards, it'll be the easiest thing in the world. And yet the whole debacle to even get a Brexit deal took about 4 years. I remember that vividly because I was working at Westminster in the UK Parliament at the time. And it was just the most insane time in the UK politics when the UK's international credibility went off the cliff, right? And that's partly the reason why I think investors don't really want to invest in the UK, because they see the UK as a bit of a basket case. And for all the Tory talk about the UK recovering faster from the pandemic and having the highest GDP post-pandemic or whatever, the fact is Brexit is absolutely hurting small businesses, and it's particularly small businesses that are on the line. I mean, if you think about a small exporter that makes soap, for example, or agricultural products, or a fishing industry in Scotland, the amount of red tape, bureaucracy, and costs involved with exporting to the EU mean that a lot of the time they just don't do it anymore. They just stop exporting. Now that's bad for our economy. That's bad for jobs. It's harder to fill jobs as well because of staff shortages and because of the visa restrictions that make it a lot harder for public services to recruit, for example, or for agricultural sector to find workers for the summer. So Brexit is quite clearly very, very damaging. I think it's very difficult to find reasons that make it look positive. I mean, every single day you get reports about Brexit hiking up our food prices, or about limiting our investment, or about causing mayhem at the border. And yet we're in this strange system where both Labour and the Tories back Brexit and aren't really willing to kind of look again, even though the majority of the British public right now backs getting back into the EU, right? If you look at polling right now, there's a consistent majority for getting back into the EU, and consistent majority of people saying that Brexit was a disaster. So yeah, Brexit is going badly, I think. The reality, and the only hope we can find from it is independence for Scotland will get us back into the EU, and we can build a different future from scratch.
Thank you, Olaf. So I'll move on to the next item. Donald Trump is alleged to have discussed potentially sensitive information about US nuclear submarines with Anthony Pratt, an Australian billionaire, 3 months after leaving office, according to a new report. According to a source close and familiar with the Australian account to investigators, forgive me, I'm going to read that again. According to a source familiar with the Australians' account to investigators for Special Counsel Jack Smith, the US news outlet ABC News reported an excited Trump allegedly discussed the supposed exact number of nuclear warheads or US submarines routinely carry, and exactly how close they supposedly can get to a Russian submarine without being detected. Smith has charged Trump with 40 criminal counts related to his retention of classified information after leaving office. The former president also faces 17 criminal counts regarding election subversion, 4 federal from Smith and 13 in the state of Georgia, and 34 concerning hush money payments to the adult film actor Stormy Daniels. Despite his legal difficulties, including civil trials for fraud and defamation, Trump is leading Republican presidential polling and could face Joe Biden in the 2024 race for the White House. According to the report, Smith did not include any information about Trump's alleged April 2021 conversation with Pratt in his June indictment against Trump. ABC said Trump spoke to Pratt at his Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida in April 2021. Pratt then allegedly shared the information about submarines within minutes of learning it, shocking a Trump employee who heard him. The ABC report alleged that Pratt went on to share the information with at least 45 people, including his own employees, journalists, foreign and Australian officials, and 3 former Australian prime ministers. It is not clear if what Trump told Pratt was accurate, ABC said. Nevertheless, investigators reportedly asked him to stop repeating what he heard. Pratt, whose corrugated packaging firm, Pratt Industries, is a US-based, reportedly told investigators he repeated what Trump told him because he wanted to show he was advocating for Australia in the US. At the time, Australia was negotiating the purchase of nuclear submarines from the US and UK in the AUKUS deal, that's the AUK-US deal. So, Olaf, I'm intrigued to hear what you have to say about this item, but just to start you off, do you think, is there any chance that the nuclear submarines that are stored in Scottish waters might have been amongst those that Trump was talking to about?
Gosh, I mean, who knows what's stashed in the secret Mar-a-Lago boxes, probably hiding in Donald Trump's toilet, right? It is just absurd, and look, the guy's a complete idiot, right? And yet he's an absolute front runner in the Republican presidential nomination race, which I think says a lot about the state of the Republican Party. But I'm segueing onto something else. I think, look, obviously the best solution to Scottish nuclear submarines not being involved would be to just get rid of them, right? And the best way to do that, to get rid of Trident, is via independence. But that's again beside the point. I think, look, this shows an absolute recklessness of a person who might be president in a year's time. And while we can't do anything about it, because obviously it's up to the American electorate, it's up to the GOP to pick their presidential candidate, it shows that Europe should really prepare for the eventuality of Trump becoming president, because while it looked like a comical prospect last year, and it looked like an outlandish suggestion that this idiot might be in the White House again, despite criminal indictments, despite having 17, I think he said 17 indictments. It seems like with every single court case and every single charge that he's actually getting stronger, because somehow the selectorate that's going to choose him as the next Republican nominee is so conspiratorial, so kind of whipped up in a frenzy that they quite like a criminal president because just they're a cult, aren't they? So I am just really really dismayed by all this. I think we face a potential prospect of the first ever president potentially standing as a candidate from custody. I know it's a bit of a far fetched prospect, but it's a possibility. And with Joe Biden's relatively poor poll ratings, he might even win from custody. So it's definitely going to be an interesting time in the months ahead, and definitely going to be following that closely. Um, and I think, look, it's really important for the EU to just stop being as dependent on the US, develop its own military capacity that perhaps goes beyond NATO. Stop relying on America as the sort of world policeman, and make sure that it strengthens its global diplomacy, because we might have to strap in for 4 really chaotic years with Trump as president, and of course in his second term he might be a lot more reckless than in his first term as well. So yeah, frankly, it's really really worrying.
Okay, you actually kind of preempted me there, Olaf, just really quickly, because time is very much against us. I was going to ask you whether you thought, what will we see first, Trump in the White House or Trump in prison? What do you think?
Uh, it may not be beyond the realms of possibility where it's Trump in prison and then in the White House pardoning himself, and then jailing Joe Biden, or jailing Hunter Biden at the very least. So honestly, I cannot make predictions at this stage, because it's a completely unpredictable scenario. I think America is just it needs to have a quiet word with itself, I think, and especially the Republican Party needs to just sit down in the quiet corner and meditate a wee bit.
Okay, we wouldn't have held you to it anyway, but I'll move on to the next item. So, Narges, forgive me, for apologies in advance for any mispronunciations here, but Narges Mohammadi, the most prominent of Iran's jailed women's rights advocates, has been awarded the 2023 Nobel Peace Prize. Ms. Mohammadi has vowed to stay in Iran and continue her activism. In a statement released after the announcement, she said, "I will never stop striving for the realisation of democracy, freedom and equality." She said that the Nobel Peace Prize will make her more resilient, determined, hopeful and enthusiastic on her path. Mohammadi has campaigned for women's rights and the abolition of the death penalty and an improvement of prison conditions inside Iran. She is serving multiple sentences in Tehran's Evin prison, amounting to about 12 years imprisonment, according to the rights organisation Frontline Defenders, the latest of the many periods she has been detained. Excuse me. Charges against her include spreading propaganda against the state. In its citation, the Norwegian Nobel Committee said it has decided to award the 2023 Nobel Peace Prize to Narges Mohammadi for her fight against the oppression of women in Iran and her fight to promote human rights and freedom for all. Ms. Mohammadi has been active from within prison, warning of a nationwide protest by publishing letters about the state of prisons and detention centres and violence against prisoners and detainees. Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, who shared a prison cell with Mohammadi in Evin, said, "I'm so pleased for her. It makes me cry. She did so much for all of us in Evin. Narges is an inspiration and a pillar to the women in the female ward in Evin for her fearless fight against the violation of women's rights, use of solitary confinement, and execution in the judicial system in Iran." The award will be viewed as a tribute to the women life freedom movement in Iran that rocked the clerical establishment last year, but has been suppressed with many activists either killed in jail, or many activists either killed or in jail. Forgive me. The protests were sparked by the death in police custody of a young Kurdish woman, Masha Amini, after she had been arrested for not wearing the hijab in line with state rules. The conflict over the wearing of the hijab continues. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights said the award highlighted the courage and determination of Iranian women in the face of reprisals, intimidation, violence, and detention. So, is there a political element, do you think, in the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize? Is this like the Nobel Peace Prize saying, "We're watching you, Iran"?
Yeah, I think, look, firstly, the work of Narges Mohammadi is absolutely commendable, and the bravery is impossible to describe and impossible to imagine. When you're living in a repressive authoritarian regime like Iran and you dare to speak up for women's rights, something that we've been taking for granted in this country for decades, it is just unimaginable, right? And obviously, it'd be far better for Narges to get out of prison and to live in a free society where she can be who she wants and not be looked down on just for being a woman, where she can have the right to participate in a free society and not have hardline religious beliefs imposed on her. But I think this is an important stepping stone. It's an important milestone in the world, firstly, showing solidarity to the Iranian Jin Jihad Azadi movement, Women Life Freedom. We've been seeing, huge solidarity protests across Europe for Mahsa Amini, following the killing of Mahsa Amini, standing in solidarity with the brave Iranian protesters. And actually, the scale of the protests in Iran really shows you that there is a bit of a revolution brewing to the Islamic Revolution from '79, and and people aren't willing to lay down the swords, metaphorically. So I think it's really important that the West and all of us keep supporting the people of Iran, keep supporting the women of Iran in sort of bravely fighting for their future, their children's future. And big credit to Narges Mohammadi for all her amazing work.
Thank you, Olaf. I'll move on to the next item. Scottish Greens MSP Gillian Mackay has said that in introducing buffer zones, Scotland will offer the strongest protections in the UK. Her members' bill to introduce safe access zones to stop anti-choice campaign groups from protesting outside medical centres and abortion service providers across Scotland was published this morning by the Scottish Parliament. Details of the bill show that it will stop anti-choice protesters from taking place within 200 metres of medical facilities. This would be the highest minimum limit anywhere in the UK and would apply to the limits of the site. It also includes extension powers that allow health boards or ministers to apply to have the size of a zone extended. The bill would allow for an unlimited maximum fine for people who breach it. Ms Mackay has received cross-party support, with more than 70 MSPs, including the First Minister Humza Yousaf, backing her campaign. She said, "There is no excuse for the harassment that for too long many people have had to endure when accessing healthcare. These protests should not be happening, and today we are an important step closer to ending them for good." Commenting on the Safe Access Zones Bill, Scottish Government Women's Health Minister Jenny Minto said, "I congratulate Gillian Mackay on her bill. This is an important milestone towards seeking national legislation to protect women from unwanted influence, distress or alarm when accessing abortion services." The decision to access abortion services is an individual and personal choice which should not be subject to public demonstration or influence outside premises providing abortion services. It is unacceptable for women to face any fear of intimidation, harassment or unwanted influence when accessing essential healthcare services. It goes without saying that the same goes for healthcare staff doing their job. The Scottish Government is grateful to Ms Mackay for the work she has undertaken to reach this stage, and we will continue supporting her members' bill as it makes its way through Parliament. Excuse me. This bill is not an attempt to restrict freedom of expression, but to safeguard public health and protect the rights of women to access healthcare without obstruction. The bill is targeted at activity opposing abortion outside premises, providing abortion services, and will not limit the ability to oppose abortion in any other locations. So, Olaf, this is a tricky one, isn't it? It seems to be that it's really difficult that you've got on one side freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and on the other you've got people who, as the item said, really are just trying to access healthcare in a way that doesn't put them under duress or stress or harm. What do you think?
Look, abortion is healthcare, and it's so important to stress that again. Abortion is healthcare, and it's absolutely up to the women to choose what they do with their bodies. It's absolutely up to the women to have autonomy, and it is just not right. It is just not fair for women who face enormously difficult choices, because nobody takes abortion lightly, to face harassment and intimidation outside the hospital just before they're about to go in for an abortion. So I think it's right that safe access zones are finally implemented. We've seen way too many women put through the agony of being met with violent and often just very harassing and intimidating protesters outside the hospitals like Sandyford. So yeah, it's great news, and credit to Julie Mackay as well for putting this forward. And it's great that the Scottish Government's been backing this throughout and really giving this backing, made sure that the bill had this national consensus in actually going through. Look, I think on a broader level, a lot of people will say, "Oh, what about freedom of speech? Right? Freedom of speech is being curtailed." Freedom of speech is sacred. I absolutely think that freedom of speech is one of the most important principles in our democracy. But harassing vulnerable women who are about to go in for an abortion, which must be one of the most difficult choices in their life, and doing that right outside the hospital doors, that is not freedom of speech. That is harassment. And I think people can still exercise their freedom of speech in different ways. People can, be against abortion in the press or on social media, or they can have protests in public squares. I'm not saying they should. I don't think that's right, because I think it's up to the women to decide about their own bodies. But people can still do that, right? No one's going to get arrested for protesting abortion. I think doing that outside the hospitals, though, is absolutely callous. And I'm very glad that Julie Mackay has put this through.
Thank you, Olaf. And I'm just going to finish that item by saying that I'm incredibly conscious that there's two men here in this studio that are talking about this issue, which doesn't really affect us personally, but I'm sure that we will be talking about this in future editions, and we will do our best to make sure that we have a gender balanced studio to talk about that. But thank you. We'll move on to the next item. More parents have been able to start work or progress their careers thanks to an initiative to expand access to school-aged children, according to a new report. 8 childcare providers across Scotland received a share of almost £600,000 from the Scottish Government to help 650 children from low-income families access school-aged childcare. The funding helped to make school-aged childcare more accessible, affordable and flexible for parents and carers from low-income families, or those most at risk of experiencing poverty. The Access to Childcare Fund Phase 2 evaluation report also highlights the positive impact of the project. Also highlights the positive impact the projects had on the health and well-being of the children and parents. It found the projects increased opportunities for children to develop social skills and strengthen relationships with both adults and peers, especially for those with additional support needs. Children and Young People Minister Natalie Dawn said, "As we mark Challenge Poverty Week, this report highlights the impact our support continues to make for children, young people and their families who are most in need, and how childcare providers can be key in supporting these families." Improving access to childcare not only brings wide-ranging benefits for the children, it also helps parents get back into work, engage in training or progress their careers. Quality childcare provision is both an anti-poverty and a pro-growth measure. It went on to say, "This report follows our commitment in the programme for government to expand our childcare offering and set out the differences that funded school-aged childcare can make to support families to enter and sustain employment." Currently, all 3 and 4-year-olds and eligible 2-year-olds are able to take up 1,140 hours of funded early learning and childcare in Scotland. Work is underway with local authorities and other partners to phase in an expanded national provision for families with 2-year-olds, as well as targeted early delivery of all age childcare for low-income families. So, Olaf, this is excellent news during a cost of living crisis, isn't it? Or is it just mitigation? That word.
Oh, it's of course, and Scotland is leading the UK in childcare provision. Scotland's got one of the most generous childcare schemes, not just in the UK but also in many parts of Europe. Under the SNP, that increased quite dramatically to 1,140 hours per year. Oh, okay. Can you hear me better? Is that better? Sorry. Yeah, and it's absolutely an investment in society. I think investing in women and investing in families is one of the best ways to ensure inclusive and sustainable growth. I think it's also a really important way to mitigate the cost of living crisis. Childcare costs are extortionately expensive in many parts of the UK, and it's great that this is putting so much focus on helping families through this. It is, a mitigating factor. I think bigger things have to be done to ensure that people have the dignity and the prosperity they deserve. So, of course, we should be investing in affordable homes. We should be investing in higher pay, making sure that the minimum wage goes up above inflation. We need to make sure that public sector workers are properly valued and have their salaries raised above inflation to properly thank them for the service. And I think also, we need to think bigger when it comes to policies to recover from the cost of living crisis. But childcare wise, I think Scotland's doing a pretty good job. I think a lot of countries can be looking towards Scotland and learning from the best. Of course, that's on top of things like the baby box, which is a transformative policy, which is giving everyone an equal start in life. It's been copied by countries like Ireland already. Things like the Scottish Child Payment, which again is on top of the free childcare, £25 a week for under 16s who are eligible. That a lot of charities called it game changing. So the Scottish Government is doing a pretty good job on that field. I think there's always more to do. But yeah, childcare is one of the biggest and most important investments in cost of crisis, for sure.
Thank you. We've got about 1 minute left. I just wondered, would you say that these kinds of figures and these kinds of policies give a good idea of what an independent Scottish government would look like and be able to do?
Well, I think so. At least that, right? I mean, let's hope that the independent Scotland can be a genuinely transformative country, which can have a much fairer economy, an economy that actually works for people, not against them, where people don't have to work for the economy, but the economy works for us. An economy that's based on well-being and common prosperity, wealth owned by communities, not by hedge funds managers and big asset companies. So I think, look, there's so much hope when it comes to independence. I think it's our best way of getting that fairer society, that healthier society. The biggest question right now for the SNP and for the movement is how do we get there? And I think with the SNP conference coming up in just 10 days' time, I think we will hopefully move forward on that path, get some clarity on that, and get campaigning.
Thank you, Olaf, and we're certainly hoping to be able to be at the conference here at Broadcasting Scotland, and we're going to try and cover it. Looking forward to that.
Seeing you there.
Yeah, but thank you
Cool.
again for joining us for the second time in just a couple of days. That's great.
Apologies for my bad internet connection as well earlier. I'm not quite sure what went on, but hopefully we fixed it.
Yeah, no, honestly, it's been as clear as a bell, so thank you so much for all your effort.
Right.
We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian.
So that's about it for this evening, but before I go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of you, our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. You know that our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you could afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Our need to reach our £30,000 target to pay our bills is still pressing. However, Your generosity has given us a little more time. We've now raised over £18,500 and we are able to continue making programmes for the next few weeks on that money, but our need to raise the remaining £11,500 is still really urgent. But thank you for watching and good night.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.